My name is Charlotte Olson. I'm 38 years old, a pediatric nurse, and a mother living in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. For the past 14 years, my work has been both my passion and my refuge, caring for sick children, comforting their parents, and juggling the constant unpredictability of the hospital. But no matter how long or exhausting my shifts are, I always come home with one thing on my mind: my daughter, Emily. Emily had just turned 10, the big double-digit birthday that every child waits for with so much excitement and hope. I remember the weeks leading up to her party, how I carved out every spare moment between my night shifts and hospital rounds to plan something special for her. I wanted her to feel loved, celebrated, and surrounded by family, even though I knew there had been some tensions brewing. I wasn't naive, but I tried to hold on to hope that this birthday could bring us all together, even if just for a few hours. I spent hours decorating the house with pink and lavender balloons, streamers, and fairy lights. Emily's favorite, unicorn-themed cupcakes, sat neatly on the kitchen counter, alongside a cake I had baked myself late into the night after my 12-hour shift. I arranged party favors and games, all the little details that make a child's birthday feel magical. Despite the exhaustion clawing at my bones, I smiled constantly, thinking about the moment Emily would walk into the room and see everything I had done just for her. I had sent invitations weeks in advance, to my mother Diane, my younger brother Mark, even the extended family I wasn't always close with. The last thing I wanted was for Emily to feel alone on such a milestone. I imagined Diane showing up with a warm smile, Mark teasing Emily in that older brother way, and our family gathering around the table, their laughter filling the rooms with life. But as the clock ticked closer to the party time, I noticed my phone stayed silent. No RSVPs, no questions, no confirmations. In the end, no one from my family came. I remember standing in the living room that afternoon, watching Emily excitedly greet her classmates and neighborhood friends, while a pit settled deep in my stomach. I forced a smile every time she looked at me, oblivious to the absence of those she should have known would be there. I kept whispering to myself, "It doesn't matter. This day is about Emily." But inside, the sting of rejection was sharp and bitter. The house was filled with children's laughter, the shouts of, "Pass the piñata," and the sweet scent of birthday cake. But underneath it all, my heart was quietly breaking. I kept busy, trying to mask the hurt as I handed out party favors and took endless photos. Emily's joy was so pure, and I didn't want to taint it with the silence coming from people who should have been her family. Despite it all, I stayed composed. I wanted to be the strong mother she needed, the one who could shield her from the cracks in the family foundation. But as the guests left and quiet returned to the house, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The unanswered invitations, the empty spaces where my mother and brother should have been, they all whispered a painful truth I was just beginning to face. That birthday was meant to be a celebration of love and togetherness, but it revealed something far more complicated: a family divided, and a mother caught in the middle, trying to keep the pieces from falling apart. I tucked Emily into bed that night, watching her drift to sleep with a smile, unaware of the storm beneath the surface. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that this day, which should have been a joyful milestone, was only the beginning of a much deeper struggle. Growing up, the pattern was always the same. My mother Diane's eyes would light up for Mark, but barely flicker for me. I remember countless family gatherings where Mark was the center of attention, showered with praise and gifts, while my own accomplishments seemed to dissolve into the background noise. When Mark graduated high school, there was the big party. The balloons, the catered food, the streamers spelling out, "Congratulations, Mark!" A celebration that felt like a public declaration of his success. Me? My high school valedictorian speech was met with polite nods and a quick change of subject. Diane smiled, but her warmth felt reserved, as if my achievements were expected and therefore unremarkable. It wasn't just the big milestones. The subtle ways Diane showed favoritism carved deep grooves of doubt and confusion in me. If I brought home a good report card, she might say, "That's nice, dear," almost distracted. But when Mark did well, her voice would brim with excitement, her stories about him shared around the dinner table for days. Even when I tried to share my own struggles or triumphs, They were often brushed aside or minimized, as if my feelings didn't deserve the same weight. That disparity wasn't lost on me, not as a child, and certainly not as a young adult trying to earn a place where I felt truly seen. Family gatherings were tense under the surface. Instead of warm reunions, they felt like competitions where I was always the underdog. Diane's gaze would drift past me to Mark, her words laced with expectations only he seemed to fulfill. Invitations to events were sometimes sent to me as an afterthought, or not at all. While Mark was courted with enthusiasm, the golden child favored above all. I learned early on that if I wanted approval, I had to work twice as hard, and even then, it felt like I was running a race I could never win. I remember one particular birthday party of Mark's, where the entire family gathered in a fancy restaurant downtown. The noise, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all seemed to orbit around him. Diane beamed as she toasted his health and future, her pride a spotlight so bright it threw the rest of us into shadow. I sat nearby, careful to keep my smile genuine while the knot in my stomach tightened. When I tried to share a project I had been working on at the hospital, Diane's attention shifted away, and Mark cracked a joke about how boring grown-up stuff was. Laughter erupted, but it stung. That night, I understood that my mother's love had conditions, and I was failing to meet them simply by being myself. Over the years, I tried to rationalize her behavior as a form of tough love, convincing myself that maybe Diane expected more because she knew I was capable. I told myself that someday, my sacrifices and quiet achievements would be recognized. Maybe this was her way of pushing me to be better, to strive harder. But that hope was fragile, worn thin by repeated dismissals and silent sidelines. Each exclusion chipped away at my confidence and my sense of belonging. Even more painful was the way Diane's favoritism affected Mark. He was spoiled, yes, but also entitled, leaning on our mother's approval as a shield from responsibility. I watched him make reckless decisions, knowing my silent support would fill the gaps when things fell apart. Diane's unwavering backing of Mark made it clear whose problems mattered, and whose did not. It became an unspoken rule. Family loyalty was reserved for Mark, while I was expected to carry the weight without complaint. Those dynamics shaped the way I approached my own family as an adult. I wanted to break the cycle, to create a space where Emily would never feel invisible or less than. But the echoes of my childhood, the favoritism, the emotional distance, haunted me. Diane's favoritism was not just an old wound. It was a living force that continued to ripple through our lives, coloring every interaction, every expectation, every moment of hope. It was a reminder that for some families, love and support are not evenly shared, and that sometimes the hardest part is learning when to stop waiting for something that might never come. Over the years, I poured myself into supporting my family in ways that left little room for anything else. The financial burden, especially, often fell heavily on my shoulders. I remember the pressure mounting when Mark announced he wanted to go to college out of state, an expensive private school that Diane insisted was the only choice for his future. I didn't hesitate to step in, quietly covering his tuition and living expenses. I convinced myself it was an investment in family, a way to keep peace and ensure Mark had every advantage. But looking back, it was less about choice and more about obligation, a role I never asked for but felt trapped by. It wasn't just college tuition. Emergencies popped up, car breakdowns, unexpected medical bills for Diane, house repairs after storms. Each time I rearranged my budget, dipping into savings or taking a few extra shifts at the hospital to cover costs I knew wouldn't be repaid. When Diane's health declined after a minor stroke, I became her primary caregiver, juggling hospital visits and medication management on top of my already demanding nursing job. I didn't complain. I put on a brave face for Emily and Greg, telling myself that this was what family meant: unconditional support, no matter the cost. There were nights I remember vividly, exhausted from a double shift, only to come home and find Diane needing help with simple tasks or Mark calling, desperate for money after yet another reckless decision. I answered every call, canceled personal plans, and rearranged my schedule without a second thought. Sometimes Greg expressed concern, worried I was stretching myself too thin. "Charlotte, "You can't pour from an empty cup," he'd say gently. But I felt trapped. How could I say no to family? How could I let them down when they always expected me to be the pillar holding everything up? I also passed on career opportunities, promotions that required relocation or longer hours, because I knew stepping back was necessary to manage the family chaos. Greg was supportive but frustrated, sensing the toll it took on me. Still, I held on to the hope that someday, this imbalance would shift, that my sacrifices would be acknowledged and met with appreciation rather than demands. I dreamed of a family that worked as a team, where I wasn't the endless giver, but an equal partner in both love and responsibility. But the pattern was relentless. Whenever I tried to pull back or assert boundaries, Diane's tone shifted. She'd guilt-trip me with phrases like, "Family comes first," or remind me of all I owed her for raising me. Mark, spoiled and entitled, rarely showed gratitude. Instead, he expected my help as a given, often mocking my exhaustion or dismissing my concerns. It was a silent agreement within the family. Charlotte provides, Mark receives, Diane oversees, and everyone else is expected to fall in line. Even Emily felt the ripple effects. I worried that by constantly putting my family's needs ahead of my own, I was modeling a cycle of self-sacrifice that might one day leave her feeling invisible or burdened. I wanted more. For her, for myself, for a family where love wasn't conditional and support was mutual. Yet, each call for help drained a little more of my energy and hope. Looking back, I realized just how much I carried alone. The late-night calls, the unpaid bills, the emotional labor. It was a heavy, invisible load. I was the safety net, the emergency fund, the emotional anchor, all rolled into one. But as the years wore on, the cracks began to show. My kindness was met with entitlement, my generosity with disregard, and no matter how much I gave, it was never enough to bridge the distance or heal the wounds. This quiet, exhausting imbalance set the stage for what came next, when the unspoken expectations exploded into demands, and the fragile hope I clung to was tested beyond endurance. It was a painful lesson in realizing that family loyalty isn't just about giving, it's about respect, reciprocity, and knowing when to say no. And that's a lesson I was only beginning to learn. Emily's birthday party was supposed to be a bright, joyful day, a milestone filled with laughter, friends, and family. I had poured my heart into every detail, hoping to create a memory that would make her feel truly special. But as the afternoon unfolded, the absence of my mother Diane and brother Mark was painfully obvious, a silent wound that throbbed beneath the festive surface. The invitations I had sent weeks earlier had gone unanswered. No texts, no calls, no, "We'll be there." I caught myself glancing at my phone more times than I care to admit, each time hoping to see a message that never came. The doorbell rang repeatedly with neighborhood kids and classmates, their smiles bright and natural, filling the house with an energy that should have been enough, but it wasn't. The empty seats at the dining table, the missing voices of those who should have been family, made the laughter feel hollow. I tried to keep the mood light. "Emily, come here. Time for cake," I said with a smile, even though my throat tightened. Her eyes sparkled as she ran toward the table, oblivious to the missing people she had hoped to see. I watched as she blew out the candles on her unicorn cake, her cheeks flushed with excitement. For her, it was perfect. For me, it was a bittersweet reminder of how far the distance had grown. Later, when a neighbor, Mrs. Harris from next door, casually mentioned how Diane was already busy planning Mark's quinceañera, I felt a cold stab in my chest. Her words were light, almost offhand, but to me, they echoed like an accusation. Why did my daughter's birthday, a decade-long celebration, not even earn a place on their calendar? Was Emily's day just an inconvenient blip compared to Mark's upcoming extravaganza? The unfairness was sharp, raw. The moment stuck with me. I wanted to push those thoughts aside, not let the bitterness seep in, but it was hard. Every time I heard Mark's name, it was tied to grand parties and expensive gifts, while my efforts, countless late nights baking, decorating, and juggling my exhausting nursing shifts, seemed invisible. It was as if I was shouting into a void, and no one was listening. Then there was the text from Diane. I didn't expect much, but even a simple happy birthday message from her would have softened the edges of the day. Instead, I received a brief, impersonal text sent directly to Emily's phone. No warmth, no mention of the party, no acknowledgement of the effort. Just 2 words. Happy birthday. I saw Emily glance at it, her smile faltering for a split second before she pushed the phone aside. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that sometimes people don't show love the way we hope. But inside, the sting of rejection clung tightly. That same evening, I overheard Mark on the phone with a friend. His voice carried through the thin walls as he laughed and mocked Emily's birthday party, calling it boring and nothing special. His words hit me like a slap, cruel and dismissive. Emily, of course, couldn't hear him, but I did, and I felt all the frustration and hurt well up inside me. How could someone so close, someone who was supposed to care, belittle a day meant to celebrate my daughter's life? I clenched my fists, biting back tears. I wanted to shout, to defend Emily's day, to confront Mark and Diane about the emptiness that their absence signified. But I reminded myself to stay composed. Emily's happiness was fragile and precious, and I was determined not to let their neglect ruin her moment. So I smiled, kept the party afloat, and stayed strong. After the last guest left, the house fell silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Emily was tucked into bed, her face glowing with the joy of a day well spent. But as I closed her door, the ache inside me grew heavier. The empty chairs and the silence of my family's absence screamed louder than any words could. I sat down in the living room, the decorations still fluttering gently in the evening breeze, and thought about what this day really meant. The party had shown me the truth I was reluctant to face. My family's disregard ran deeper than I'd admitted to myself. Diane's indifference, Mark's mockery. It wasn't just about a missed birthday party. It was a reflection of the fractures that had long existed between us. I was left wondering how many more celebrations would pass with empty seats and quiet phones, and whether the distance between us could ever be bridged. That night, I lay awake, the festive decorations around me suddenly feeling like symbols of a broken connection. I wanted so desperately for my family to be there, to show up for Emily, to show up for me, but they didn't. And as the house grew quiet, I realized that this was no ordinary disappointment. It was the start of something much harder to face, an unraveling of the ties I had tried so hard to keep intact. Days after Emily's birthday party, the silence from my family didn't soften. It grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Then, without warning, my phone lit up with a message from Diane. I didn't expect much, but what I saw made my stomach twist. Need $1,650 for Mark's quinceañera expenses. Family obligation. Please send ASAP. No hello, no softening words. Just a cold demand that landed like a verdict. I stared at the screen, rereading the message, trying to digest the bluntness of it all. The nerve. Not a word about Emily's birthday. Not an ounce of acknowledgement for the day I'd worked so hard to make special for my daughter. Instead, they asked for more money. The same family that ignored our celebration now holding out their hand, like it was my duty to fill their coffers. Their priorities were clear, and it felt like a slap in the face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. I wanted to scream, to pour out everything I was feeling, the hurt, the exhaustion, the betrayal, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I typed back, "Sorry, Diane, we can't help with that right now." Then I hit send, my pulse quickening as I braced for the fallout. Almost immediately, the responses came. Diane's texts arrived in a relentless stream, each one dripping with guilt and accusation. How can you be so selfish? Mark's quinceañera is a family event. You're supposed to support your brother. You've taken so much already. This is your responsibility. The tone shifted from demand to manipulation, as if I owed them everything just because we shared a last name. I felt the familiar squeeze of guilt tighten around my chest. The voice in my head whispered, "Family first. Don't abandon them. Keep the peace." But deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't asking for help. It was an expectation, a demand wrapped in entitlement. And after everything, I wasn't prepared to just give in. So the next day, when the texts kept pouring in, I made a decision. I sent a single dollar, just one, along with a short message. Congrats. It was a quiet, pointed refusal, a symbol that I was no longer playing by their rules. I wasn't going to bankroll their extravagance or pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. That $1 message changed everything. Diane's response was immediate and furious. Her texts escalated, venom filling the words. "Is this a joke?" she demanded. "You're causing a scandal. I'm calling the police if you don't send the full amount." The threat caught me off guard. Police involvement? Over money? Over family? It was absurd and terrifying. I sat down, heart hammering in my chest as I read and reread her messages. The idea that my family would weaponize the law against me, simply because I refused to be their ATM, was like a cruel twist of fate. I thought about Emily, about Greg, about the life I was trying to build. Was this the price of standing up for myself? As the hours passed, the tension mounted. Diane's texts became more aggressive, accusing me of betrayal, selfishness, and greed. Mark chimed in too, his messages mocking and dismissive, trying to shame me into compliance. But I refused to respond further. I couldn't let their anger dictate my decisions anymore. I knew I was at a crossroads. Giving in would mean surrendering my dignity and enabling a toxic cycle. Standing firm risked fracturing what little remained of our relationship. But the truth was clear. I couldn't keep sacrificing to a family that only showed up when they needed something from me. That night, as I lay awake, my phone silent for the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, but beneath it, a hardening resolve took root. For Emily's sake, for my own, I had to start saying no. The battle lines were drawn, and the next move was mine. That night, after the last furious text from Diane blinked off my screen, I found myself sitting across from Greg at the kitchen table, the glow of the overhead light casting long shadows in the quiet house. Emily was asleep upstairs, her soft breathing a fragile reminder of why I had to be strong. Greg's eyes searched mine, a mix of concern and support shining through. He reached across and took my hand, steadying me when my thoughts threatened to spiral. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Charlotte," Greg said quietly. "They're pushing your limits." His voice was calm, but I could hear the unspoken worry beneath it. "You don't have to carry this alone." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was true. For years I had carried so much: emotional weight, financial responsibility, the quiet labor of keeping a family together that didn't appreciate or even notice. And now, with Diane's demands and Mark's mockery still ringing in my ears, I felt the weight pressing down harder than ever. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder where I'd been meticulously tracking every transfer, every bill I'd covered, every text message that had slipped past as ordinary, but now felt like evidence of one-sided loyalty. The numbers sprawled across the spreadsheet were staggering. Thousands of dollars sent to cover Mark's college tuition, car repairs, and impulsive spending sprees. Funds used to fix the leaky roof at Diane's house, pay overdue medical bills, and bail out emergencies I never asked to be a part of. The total added up to more than I had ever imagined. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I scrolled through our text conversations, each one a thread of manipulation or entitlement. Diane's messages demanding money with no acknowledgement of my own struggles. Mark's dismissive remarks, the snide jokes about my exhaustion, the way they treated my sacrifices as invisible, expected. I remembered the quiet arguments that never escalated, the silent apologies I never received. A heavy sigh escaped me. "Greg," I said softly, "I've been so focused on keeping the peace, on being the good daughter and good mother, that I forgot what peace feels like without all this." My voice cracked, the years of bottled-up frustration finding a way out. I'm exhausted, and I realize that no matter how much I give, it's never enough for them. It's like I'm invisible when it comes to their needs. Greg squeezed my hand gently. "You're not invisible to me, Charlotte, and you shouldn't be invisible to them either. This isn't just about money or missed birthdays. It's about respect, about knowing your worth." The truth of his words settled in me slowly. like sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. For so long, I had let their demands and dismissals define my self-worth. I had been the family's safety net, the fixer, the unpaid caregiver, the reluctant ATM. But now, the emotional toll was undeniable. I was drained, not just physically from my nursing shifts, but emotionally from the constant cycle of giving without receiving. I always thought they'd come around, I admitted, eyes fixed on the screen showing the financial records, that if I just kept trying, kept helping, they'd finally appreciate me, that they'd see how much I do. I shook my head, bitter. But instead, they expect more. They take more. Greg's expression hardened with quiet resolve. And you don't have to let them. You have the right to protect yourself. And Emily. I thought about Emily, tucked away in her room, her bright smile earlier that day, the pure joy I had struggled to keep intact despite the empty seats around her. I wanted to shield her from this dysfunction, to give her the family love I never fully received. But how could I do that if I continued to let this drain me? A knot tightened in my chest as I recalled Diane's ultimatum, the threat of police over money, a weaponizing of family ties I never imagined. That was a line crossed. The realization hit me with a mix of fear and clarity. This wasn't a family that cared for me or Emily's happiness. This was a family that assumed my loyalty was limitless and my resources endless. I closed the laptop and looked up at Greg. I have to stop this. I can't keep giving when it hurts more than it heals. I have to set boundaries. Real ones. For Emily's sake. And for mine. Greg nodded, relief softening his face. And I'm here. We'll face this together. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between us. The emotional exhaustion I'd carried for years was now transforming into a quiet but fierce resolve. I wasn't naive. I knew this path would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of control, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim my life and protect my daughter from the fractures that ran so deep. That night, as the house grew still, I allowed myself to feel the pain fully, not to drown in it, but to acknowledge it as a necessary step toward healing. The road ahead was uncertain, but the first step was clear. I owed them nothing more until they proved they deserved it, and I was ready to begin that hard journey. That night, after Greg and I sat quietly at the kitchen table, the gravity of what I was about to do settled over me like a thick fog. It wasn't just a matter of refusing money or saying no to their demands anymore. This was about protecting everything I had built for Emily and myself. Our home, our future, our peace of mind. I knew I needed to take practical, concrete steps to safeguard us from the fallout of Diane and Mark's entitlement. For the first time, I realized that emotional boundaries alone weren't enough. I had to be strategic and deliberate in guarding what was mine. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I made the call to a family lawyer Greg had once mentioned. I felt a knot in my stomach as I explained the situation in hushed tones, wary of the possibility that Diane or Mark might overhear or intercept any conversations. I told the lawyer everything: how Diane had ignored Emily's birthday, the financial demands for Mark's quinceañera, the guilt trips, the threats of police involvement. My voice was steady but carried the weight of months, years, of unspoken pain and exhaustion. The lawyer listened patiently, asking detailed questions about ownership of our home, bank accounts, and any legal documents related to my daughter's inheritance. I realized then how little I had thought about securing these things before, trusting that family would do right by us, that love would protect us. The lawyer explained the importance of updating wills, establishing clear ownership, and tightening control on joint accounts and property access. Each suggestion felt like armor, a necessary protection against the family I once hoped would support us unconditionally. Back at home, I spent hours poring over paperwork, financial statements, bank records, insurance policies, and legal documents. I updated beneficiary forms to ensure Emily's inheritance was secure and unreachable by anyone else. I double-checked the deed to our house, realizing that although Diane co-owned the property, I could legally restrict her access if necessary. The thought of locking her out made my heart ache, but I knew it was a boundary I would have to enforce to protect my family. I also began compiling the evidence: screenshots of text messages where Diane demanded money, Mark's disparaging remarks, my records of financial support over the years. It wasn't easy reliving the moments I had tried to bury or rationalize, but these documents had become my shield. I labeled and stored everything carefully, preparing in case the conflicts escalated to legal or police interventions. The cold clarity of this work was a stark contrast to the emotional chaos I felt inside, but I knew it was necessary. Throughout all of this, Greg was my anchor. He helped me make phone calls, organize files, and think through each step. Every time I felt overwhelmed, he reminded me, "This is about safety and dignity. You're doing what you must for Emily." His steady presence gave me strength, and I felt less alone in a battle that had felt so isolating for so long. At home, I started quietly changing passwords on shared accounts we held with Diane and Mark, from utilities to online banking portals. I notified neighbors discreetly about potential changes in door access, preparing them to support me if Diane tried to enter uninvited. It was strange to feel this level of caution toward my own mother, but trust had been broken too many times. I held conversations with Emily in small, age-appropriate ways, mostly about the importance of safety and respecting our home. She noticed the tension, but I worked hard to keep her shielded from the worst of it, focusing on her school, her friends, and her upcoming events. I didn't want her to carry the burden I was facing, but I also knew I was laying the groundwork for a different kind of family dynamic, one rooted in respect and protection rather than obligation and pain. Meanwhile, I kept my resolve quiet. I didn't share details with Diane or Mark. Not yet. They had to see that I was no longer vulnerable to their manipulation. I maintained a calm, neutral tone in the few texts I sent, careful not to give away the extent of my preparations. Inside, I was steeling myself for the confrontation that would inevitably come, knowing that the next moves I made could change everything. At night, when the house was silent except for Emily's soft breathing, I would sit at the desk and review the files again, running through conversations in my head, rehearsing calm responses. Each document, each note, was a step toward reclaiming control. The locks would change soon, the boundaries would be drawn, and for the first time in years, I felt the flicker of hope that I could protect my family from the toxic patterns that had defined us for too long. But even as I prepared, a deep ache remained. The ache of knowing that the people who should have been my greatest allies were now the ones I needed to guard against. The thought haunted me, but I pushed it aside. This was no longer about forgiveness or reconciliation. This was about survival, and I was ready to survive. After making the quiet but decisive decision to reclaim my boundaries, I knew I had to start shifting the way I responded to Diane and Mark. It wasn't just about saying no. It was about changing the entire dynamic that had allowed their entitlement to spiral unchecked for so long. So I began to pull away, carefully but firmly, like slowly turning down a faucet rather than snapping the handle off entirely. The first step was to stop answering Diane's calls right away. For years, I'd felt the pressure to pick up immediately. After all, what if it was an emergency? But now, each ring sounded more like a summons to guilt and manipulation. So I let the phone ring longer, letting her voice go to voicemail more often than not. When I did answer, my responses were short, neutral, and unemotional. No details, no justifications, just polite acknowledgement before I redirected the conversation elsewhere or ended it gently. I kept my voice steady, careful not to give her the openings she would exploit. Mark's calls followed a similar pattern, though his tone was usually less formal and more demanding. I used the same approach: delay, minimal engagement, and eventually ignoring texts that felt like veiled criticism or attempts to provoke a reaction. I stopped volunteering information about my schedule, my finances, or the household. I shielded Greg and Emily from the fallout, never letting them overhear the growing tension or catch the undercurrents of resentment. Gradually, I also began tapering off the financial support that had become an unspoken expectation. For years, my bank accounts had been an emergency fund for Mark's reckless spending, Diane's medical bills, and unexpected crises that always seemed to fall on my shoulders. I didn't announce this change. I simply made transfers less frequently and in smaller amounts. If Diane or Mark asked, I gave vague answers about budgeting or focusing on family savings. Any pushback from them was met with quiet firmness. I was done explaining. The hardest part was declining family obligations without getting pulled back into the old patterns of guilt and obligation. Invitations to dinners, weekend visits, even simple favors, each one became a moment of internal struggle. But I practiced saying no softly but clearly, sometimes citing exhaustion from work, other times needing to focus on Emily and Greg. I stopped volunteering for tasks that weren't mine to carry. It was strange at first, this resistance to immediate agreement, but each refusal chipped away at their assumptions that I would always acquiesce. Meanwhile, I took practical steps to secure our household. I changed passwords on shared accounts with Diane and Mark. Everything from the utility bills to online banking and digital locks. It was a small but symbolic act. This was our home, and I had the right to control who had access. I quietly informed our immediate neighbors about the upcoming lock change, asking them to keep an eye out and be ready to support if Diane or Mark showed up unannounced. It felt surreal to be making these preparations against my own family, but I knew trust had been broken beyond repair. Throughout this time, I kept conversations with Greg measured and calm, sharing my plans only in fragments to avoid overwhelming him or making the situation feel hopeless. He remained my rock, reminding me I wasn't alone and grounding me when frustration or sadness threatened to overwhelm. With Emily, I was even more careful, shielding her from the growing tension, focusing instead on her school, friends, and daily joys. I wanted to preserve her innocence as long as possible, even as I was preparing for battles that might spill into our lives. At work, I felt the shift too. I had more emotional space now, fewer late-night calls from Diane or Mark demanding help, fewer texts that stole my attention. The relief was subtle, but real. I could breathe a little easier, focus more fully on my patients without the constant background noise of family drama. But the family on the other side didn't yet realize the full extent of this distance. Diane and Mark noticed the delays, the missed calls, the decreased financial support. They grumbled, complained, and occasionally sent sharp texts accusing me of being cold or selfish. But they underestimated how resolute I had become. I didn't engage. I didn't justify. I simply continued to hold my ground, steady and unyielding. I learned to use coded language when speaking with Greg and Emily, small phrases that conveyed safety and strength without alarming them. "Mommy's working on some big grown-up stuff," I told Emily when she asked why Aunt Diane hadn't called. Greg and I often exchanged looks during tense moments, silently reaffirming our shared commitment to protect our family from the storm brewing just beyond our door. Each day of this gradual distancing felt like pulling away from quicksand, slow, careful, and with trembling hands. I was severing the tendrils of expectation and obligation that had long drained me, preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would follow. But beneath the calm exterior, my heart still carried the ache of what was being lost, a family fractured not by accident, but by years of imbalance, neglect, and entitlement. The quiet was unsettling, but necessary. And as I laid the groundwork for what was to come, I held on to the flicker of hope that this new detachment might finally bring Emily and me the peace we needed. The locks would change soon, the boundaries would be drawn, and the next chapter of this painful journey was just beginning. The morning the locksmith arrived, my heart was pounding beneath my calm exterior. It was early, just as the pale light began to stretch into our quiet Ohio neighborhood, and the world outside was still catching its breath. I stood by the front door, watching the locksmith unpack his tools with methodical precision, each click and metallic clink sounding louder than usual in the silence of the house. This wasn't just a routine change of locks. It was a boundary being etched in steel and wood, a line drawn where none had been firm enough before. I glanced around the living room, still scattered with traces of Emily's birthday decorations, pink balloons drooping slightly, a few leftover party favors on the coffee table. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and sugar from the cupcakes I'd baked. It felt surreal, almost like the home I wanted it to be was being reborn through this act of self-preservation. When the locksmith finished, he handed me the new set of keys, and I turned them over in my palms slowly, as if testing their weight, their promise. These keys represented more than security. They were the physical manifestation of the decision I had agonized over for weeks. For years, Diane had enjoyed a sort of unchallenged access to my home, my life, and my resources. Mark, too, had wandered in and out as if entitled to both the space and the support, but no longer. Later that day, I composed a message to Diane, carefully crafted, clear, and firm. I didn't want to open a door to more guilt trips or anger, so I kept it straightforward. Diane, I've changed the locks on the house. You and Mark no longer have access. I will not be funding Mark's lifestyle or any of your demands. I've supported the family for years and have the documentation to prove it. This ends now. I hesitated a moment before hitting send, feeling a mixture of relief and dread swirl inside me. As soon as it was gone, I braced myself for the inevitable storm of responses, from anger, disbelief, to accusations. But I knew this was necessary. My daughter's safety, my family's peace, and my own sanity depended on it. Within minutes, Diane's reply arrived. Her words were sharp, dripping with entitlement and disbelief. You can't do this, Charlotte. This is our home too. You're being selfish and cruel. Mark needs your help. This isn't over. I took a deep breath and typed back with a calm I barely felt. The home is co-owned, but I have the right to secure it. My priorities have shifted. I won't enable irresponsible behavior any longer. For Emily's sake, I need peace. Mark's messages followed shortly after, mocking, dismissive, trying to provoke a reaction. What? You think you're better than us now? Good luck living without your family. But I refused to respond. Instead, I gathered the folder of evidence I'd prepared, bank statements showing years of financial support, screenshots of their demanding texts, proof of my care for Diane's health emergencies. This was my armor, the reality behind the facade Diane tried to maintain. I was ready if this escalated. Then, the unexpected happened. A knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a police officer standing on my porch, a serious but professional expression on his face. Diane had made good on her threat to involve law enforcement, claiming I was withholding family property and causing a disturbance. I opened the door cautiously, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. The officer introduced himself and asked to see proof of ownership and reason for the lock change. I handed over the deed, the legal papers I'd updated with the lawyer, and explained the situation briefly but clearly. I showed him the documentation proving my rights and the ongoing harassment from Diane and Mark. He listened attentively, nodded, and said, "Legally, you have the right to secure your home. Family disputes are complicated, but as long as you're within your rights, we can't force you to let them in." His words were a relief, but also a stark reminder of how far this had gone, how family had become a legal battleground. I thanked him, and as he left, I closed the door behind me with a firm click, feeling a new kind of strength settle in my chest. That evening, I sat down with Greg and Emily, explaining in gentle terms that some changes were necessary to keep us safe and happy. Emily looked up at me with trust in her eyes, and I felt a swell of protectiveness and hope. The locks had changed. The boundaries were clear, and though the path ahead promised more challenges, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my family's future on my own terms. The moment Diane and Mark realized they couldn't just walk into the house anymore, the ground beneath their entitlement began to crumble. For years, they'd treated our home like an open doorway, a place to drop by whenever Mark needed a bailout, or Diane thought she deserved another favor. But now, the new locks were an unambiguous message. Those days were over. I could almost hear the shock and disbelief echoing through their conversations as the reality sank in. Diane's phone began buzzing incessantly, not just with my texts, but with calls from friends and extended family whom she'd roped into the drama. Her voice, once calm and commanding, turned desperate and sharp as she fired off messages demanding answers and pressuring me to reverse what I'd done. "You can't lock me out of my own home." One text read, "You're tearing this family apart," but I stayed silent, refusing to engage in the emotional storm she was trying to whip up. Mark was no less furious. His arrogance cracked to reveal panic when he realized his financial support was drying up faster than he could spin excuses. Gone were the days when he could call me at any hour, expecting money to appear like magic in his bank account. Instead, his texts slid into my phone with increasing irritation and veiled threats. "You think you're better than us now?" he sneered in one. "Good luck surviving without your family." But I refused to give him the reaction he craved. Word of the rift began to spread beyond our immediate circle. Neighbors who had once seen us as a picture-perfect family started whispering about the tension that now simmered beneath the surface. Friendly faces at Emily's school asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, and even some distant relatives called, hesitating between support and curiosity. The fragile image Diane had carefully cultivated, the one where she was the matriarch keeping things together, was unraveling quickly. Diane's frustration took a new form. Frantic, relentless texting and calls that invaded every quiet moment. She enlisted friends and acquaintances to pressure me, sending messages like, "Charlotte, you're breaking this family. Think about Emily." It was a familiar tactic, weaponizing guilt and love against me. But this time, the words bounced off a wall of steel I hadn't found before. I was done feeling responsible for their happiness at my own expense. One afternoon, her texts escalated into outright accusations. "You're cruel and selfish," she wrote. "Mark needs his sister and you're abandoning him. You'll regret this." I stared at the screen, the sting of her words trying to pierce the resolve I'd spent weeks building. But I typed back nothing. Silence was my loudest answer. Meanwhile, Mark's social circle wasn't spared from the fallout. Friends who had once admired his carefree lifestyle started questioning his stability. Creditors began circling with reminders and warnings, and the stories of his sudden financial cutoff leaked into conversations. The facade of the golden child was cracking, and for the first time, the consequences of Diane and Mark's entitlement were no longer masked by my quiet bailout. Despite all this chaos, I remained composed. Greg stood firmly by my side, his steady calm a balm to the storm raging around us. He helped me keep Emily's world as normal as possible, shielding her from the ugliness while reinforcing that our home was still a place of safety and love. I noticed Emily beginning to relax more, sensing that the tension surrounding us was no longer invisible but manageable, and that we were reclaiming our peace. Friends and neighbors, sensing the shift, began to offer quiet support. A few relatives expressed sympathy, acknowledging how unfair the situation had become. But others took Diane's side, criticizing me for breaking up the family, as if my years of giving and forgiveness didn't count. Their voices were a reminder that family loyalty is complicated, often messy, and rarely unanimous. Each day brought new texts and calls from Diane, her tone swinging between desperation and anger. "You're making a mistake," she warned. "This will come back to haunt you." But I had come to understand that the real mistake had been letting her and Mark's entitlement go unchecked for so long. My refusal to engage with their manipulations was a boundary that could not be crossed. The house, our home, stood quiet and secure behind the new locks, a physical barrier that mirrored the emotional walls I was building. With every unanswered call, every ignored text, I felt my strength grow. I wasn't just protecting a house. I was protecting Emily's childhood, Greg's peace, and my own dignity. The cost was high, but the price of continued silence and sacrifice was far greater. Yet, beneath the calm surface, I knew the battle was far from over. Diane and Mark's fury had only ignited, and the ripple effects were spreading through our family and community. But the most important truth now was clear. I was no longer their endless resource. The game had changed, and I was ready for whatever came next. The moment I stopped funneling money into Mark's reckless habits, the effects rippled through our fractured family like a cold wave crashing onto a shore long battered by storms. I'd always been the safety net, the one who caught the fallout of bad choices, who smoothed over emergencies with quiet resilience. But without my constant bailouts, the cracks began to widen and deepen. Almost immediately, I started hearing murmurs from neighbors and acquaintances, snippets of conversations that hinted at Mark's financial unraveling. Creditors began calling repeatedly, their voices clipped and impatient, leaving terse messages that piled up on my voicemail. I could feel the tension escalate from whispers in the community to overt questions from people who had once seen our family as stable and united. Mark's careless spending caught up with him fast. Overdue bills, bounced checks, and mounting debts that no longer disappeared with a single transfer from my account. The golden child was suddenly struggling to keep his balance, and the facade was crumbling for all to see. At first, Mark tried to mask the panic behind bravado. His texts to me shifted in tone, from the usual entitlement to frustration and barely disguised desperation. "You think you're better off without us?" One message sneered, dripping with sarcasm. "Good luck paying your own bills when Mark's gone." But there was an edge to his words, a rawness that betrayed the fear lurking beneath the bluster. I didn't reply. I refused to feed into his manipulation or validate his threats. Diane's health, already fragile after her minor stroke, took a visible nosedive as the family turmoil escalated. The stress weighed on her like an invisible yoke, tightening with every unanswered call and every locked door. I saw it in her pallor during the rare times I spoke to her, the tremor in her voice as she tried to mask vulnerability with sharp retorts. The woman who had once wielded control with iron fists now seemed diminished, grasping at the fading threads of authority she thought unassailable. She began sending frantic texts filled with contradictory messages, pleas for reconciliation mixed with veiled threats, accusations dipped in emotional blackmail. "You're killing me with this coldness," she wrote one evening, her words heavy with guilt and fatigue. "Think of your daughter. Think of our family." But the guilt trips bounced off the walls I had built around myself. I was no longer the daughter who would drop everything to soothe her wounds without boundary or condition. The family's social circle started to fracture under the weight of the conflict. Longtime friends began distancing themselves, unwilling or unable to navigate the poisonous atmosphere. Invitations that once crossed our doorstep ceased, replaced by silence and polite avoidance. I overheard hushed conversations at school events and neighborhood get-togethers, sympathetic murmurs toward me, thinly veiled criticism of Diane's controlling behavior. The narrative was shifting, slowly and painfully, as the truth of years of imbalance came to light. At home, I noticed Greg's quiet worry as he watched the fallout unfold. He stood steadfast beside me, a calming presence when Diane's calls turned frantic, or Mark's messages slid into bitterness. His steady support made the upheaval bearable, a soft anchor amid the storm. Emily, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the deepening schism, her laughter and innocence a balm that reminded me why I was fighting so hard to protect our little world. Despite Diane's escalating efforts to turn extended family against me, spreading misinformation and framing me as the villain, the evidence I had compiled was a silent, unyielding testament to the years of one-sided sacrifice. Some relatives, once blindly loyal to Diane, began to question the narrative. They reached out with quiet messages of support or tentative calls to check on me, their sympathy a fragile but meaningful lifeline amid the growing isolation. Yet, others remained firmly entrenched in Diane's camp, accusing me of tearing the family apart and prioritizing money over bonds. Their words stung, but I understood that family loyalty is complicated, often tangled in patterns of denial and justification. I had to accept that not everyone would see my side. Not everyone would understand the necessity of my boundaries. Each message from Diane was a mix of desperation and menace now. "You're making a terrible mistake," she warned repeatedly. "This will come back to haunt you." But with every text, I felt less fear and more resolve. The cost of continued sacrifice was too high. I wasn't just protecting my home, I was protecting Emily's future and my own peace of mind. The house, once open and welcoming to Diane and Mark's constant comings and goings, now stood quiet and secure behind new locks and digital passwords. It was more than just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of my refusal to be invisible, a declaration that the era of unchecked entitlement was over. Though the ripple effects of this estrangement spread through our lives, strained friendships, fractured family ties, whispered judgments, the most important truth anchored me. I was no longer the endless provider. The pattern had been broken. The battle was far from over, but I had drawn a line in the sand, and I was ready to defend it, whatever storms might come next. I remember the moment I realized that setting boundaries was no longer just about saying no. It was about redefining what family meant for me and for Emily. After years of imbalance, where my efforts were met with entitlement and neglect, I understood that any future contact with Diane and Mark would have to be built on a foundation of respect, accountability, and equal effort. It wasn't a punishment or a consequence I wanted to impose lightly. It was a necessity to protect the well-being of my immediate family, Greg, Emily, and me. That realization brought with it a clarity that was both freeing and daunting. I had to be honest with myself and with them. I would no longer tolerate one-sided relationships where love and support were conditional or transactional. I drafted a message one quiet evening, trying to find the right tone. Firm but not hostile. Clear but not cruel. Diane, Mark, this family is changing. For the sake of my daughter and my marriage, I will only continue to engage if respect and accountability are mutual. I can no longer be the sole supporter, financially or emotionally, while receiving little in return. If you want a relationship, it must be based on equal effort and genuine care, not demands or manipulation. I hope you understand this is about protecting the peace and happiness that Emily deserves. Hitting send felt like closing a chapter, but also opening a door to a new kind of relationship, one that might be tentative, even fragile, but rooted in boundaries that I would no longer allow to be crossed. I knew Diane's pride and Mark's entitlement wouldn't make acceptance immediate or easy, but this was the line I drew in the sand, and I was ready to stand firm. With that message sent, I turned my attention fully to my immediate family. Greg and Emily had been my compass through the chaos. Greg's quiet strength a constant reassurance, and Emily's innocence a reminder of what I was fighting for. I wanted to nurture a home where laughter wasn't tinged with tension, where love wasn't conditional on meeting impossible expectations. Evenings at our house began to feel lighter. Emily's bedtime stories stretched longer without interruptions from frantic calls or texts. Greg and I found moments to reconnect. A quiet dinner, a shared cup of coffee after Emily was asleep, that reminded me of the life we had built together, separate from the storm of family drama. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it felt safe. I also made a promise to myself to nurture my own needs, something I had neglected for too long. I resumed hobbies I had pushed aside, like painting and journaling, small acts of self-care that reminded me I was more than just the caretaker or the provider. I learned to say no to guilt, recognizing that self-preservation was not selfishness, but a necessary foundation for sustaining love. Of course, the tension with Diane and Mark didn't evaporate overnight. Their voices still echoed in texts and occasional calls filled with veiled threats or pleas for reconciliation. But I refused to engage on their terms. Instead, I responded only when I felt it was necessary, and always with the calm, measured tone I had practiced. I was no longer the open book they could manipulate at will. The ripple effects spread quietly through our family and community. Some relatives distanced themselves, unsure where to stand, while a few surprised me with their support, offering kind words or small gestures that hinted at a shifting tide of understanding. Emily's teachers even remarked on her increased brightness and confidence, a quiet affirmation that the changes we were making at home were making a difference. Looking back, the most profound change wasn't just about cutting off access to a house or refusing financial demands. It was about reclaiming dignity. For so long, I had let my worth be defined by how much I gave to a family that barely acknowledged my sacrifices. Now, I was learning that true family isn't about obligation or control. It's about mutual respect and care. I often catch myself watching Emily play in the yard, her laughter ringing clear and joyful. In those moments, I feel an overwhelming surge of gratitude that despite everything, we found a way forward. The journey is far from over, and I know the wounds of estrangement don't heal quickly, but I'm no longer afraid to protect what matters most. Our family is smaller now, yes, but it is also stronger. And for Emily, that means growing up surrounded by love that is chosen, not demanded. A love that teaches her her boundaries matter, that her happiness is worth fighting for. The future remains uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I feel ready to face it. On my terms, with my family, and with the hope that respect and kindness can someday mend what has been broken. Until then, I hold tightly to the peace we have carved out, one boundary at a time, and one day at a time.